The cold wind that swept through the Saxon hills in the 9th century carried with it more than the scent of burning peat and wet wool. It carried tradition, brittle, unwieldy, and largely incomprehensible to modern eyes. In the shadow of pagan relics and creeping Christian law, Saxon marriages were more than unions. They were strategies, contracts, survival gambits in a world where land and lineage were all that mattered. In this world, a bride's silence was not just symbolic. It was strategic, spiritual, and often legally required. To speak was to break the spell. To remain quiet was to sanctify the bond. In early Saxon society, particularly in what is now northern Germany and England, weddings functioned less as romantic ceremonies and more as public performances of property exchange. The mund, or bride price, wasn't simply a gift. It was a declaration. This woman now falls under the legal authority, mundium, of her husband. She was moving from the guardianship of her father to that of her husband, and her silence during this ritual acknowledged the transition. A woman who spoke out, whether to object, cry, or question, could be seen as disrupting the ritual, or worse, defying her legal submission. Imagine her, 14, perhaps 15 years old, wrapped in woolen robes. Her hands are chilled but clasped in her lap. She kneels beside a hearth, not her own, while the men exchange tokens, a brooch, a belt, a hammered iron knife. They speak in low voices, and she does not speak at all. The silence wasn't merely about obedience. It had a spiritual weight as, well, pagan beliefs mingled with early Christian ideas to shape a belief that the soul was vulnerable during ceremonies of passage, birth, death, marriage. A woman's voice, it was said, could attract evil spirits or unseal oaths. Silence, then, was a form of protection. Ironically, it was also a form of consent. You may find that strange, but in Saxon law, consent was implied by inaction. To sit in silence during the exchange of the bride price and the final hand fasting was to accept the contract. There was no "I do," only not saying "I won't." Saxon legal codes, such as those of King Ine of Wessex or Athelbert of Kent, make few provisions for a woman's verbal participation in her wedding. Instead, the language centers around property, guardianship, and compensation. If a marriage was later contested, the woman's silent presence at the original exchange often served as evidence of her agreement. Should a woman flee or resist after the marriage was completed, she might be viewed as breaking an oath even, though she never spoke a word. Here's the unnerving twist. A woman who protested too loudly or publicly could be punished for disorderly conduct or for disturbing sacred rituals. In practice, that often meant physical punishment or social ostracization. If she were of high enough rank, it might mean banishment to a convent. Most early Saxon marriages took place indoors, not in churches, but in halls warmed by central hearths. These fires were not only practical, they were symbolic. The flame represented continuity, the passage of legacy from one family to another. During the wedding ritual, it was common for the groom's mother or female kin to tend the fire, ensuring it burned steadily. The bride would sit nearest the flame, but never tend it herself. To stir the fire or add fuel was to symbolically take control of the household. This could only happen after consummation and 3 nights of silence. Only then, on the 4th morning, was the bride permitted to speak. Her first words, often scripted or prompted, would mark the moment she had crossed the threshold into her new role. Until then, she was considered to be in liminal space, not daughter, not yet wife, just a body in transition. Even more strange to our ears is the expectation of silence on the wedding night. Some surviving texts, like leech books and household charms, suggest that noise during consummation could drive the spirits back into the womb or upset the blood. Silence ensured fertility, continuity, order. It's not hard to imagine the crushing psychological weight of this practice. For a young girl married off to a man she barely knew, the silence may have felt like a prison of invisible rules. Yet for some, it may have offered a kind of emotional armor, a way to detach, to survive, to go unnoticed. There were exceptions, of course, cases in which women tried to use silence to resist, by refusing to sit, to kneel, or to appear. These were acts of protest, dangerous ones. Chronicles from the 9th and 10th centuries mention women who were dragged into ceremonies, who bit their tongues or fainted in protest. But unless they spoke out, their silence was often used against them. In one recorded case from 865 CE, a noblewoman named Geofwin was forcibly married to a rival lord. She sat motionless, mute, and unresponsive for the entire ceremony. Months later, she tried to flee. The court deemed that her calm bearing during the wedding was sufficient proof of consent. She was returned to her husband's estate and never mentioned in records again. It's tempting to view this tradition through the lens of pure oppression, and in many ways it was. But there's a thread worth pulling. Some women may have used silence strategically to avoid conflict, to delay, to shift the burden of decision onto others. It was a survival strategy in a world with limited options. For the Saxon bride, silence was not golden. It was required, and its meaning could shift from protection to imprisonment, from protest to punishment. But what did it feel like to live in such silence? To be denied even the words that might free you? History rarely records the size of the unwilling. It notes alliances, not apprehensions, land transfers, not trembling hands. And yet, buried in the brittle edges of Saxon charters and cloistered annals are the faint outlines of women who, though expected to remain silent, found ways to speak without speaking. This section follows the sparse but telling trail of Edgifu of Bernicia, a minor noblewoman whose story, preserved only through monastic court logs and a crumbling account from the Lindisfarne scriptorium, offers us a rare glimpse into resistance behind ritual. The year was 886 CE. The Danelaw was entrenched, and much of Northumbria stood uncertain, not yet conquered, not yet free. The local thanes, desperate to secure their holdings, resorted to old methods, marriage as merger. Edgifu, daughter of a coastal reeve, was promised to Wulfric, a man nearly 3 times her age and twice her station. Wulfric's holdings bordered Viking-held lands. In Saxon politics, a wedding was often an act of fortification, cementing borders, forming fragile alliances between squabbling noble houses, or even appeasing encroaching warlords. What made this wedding notable, however, was Idgifu's response. At first, all appeared normal. The bride price was paid in full: 1 silver torque, a beaded brooch from Mercia, and 3 hides of land near the Ware River. The hall was prepared, witnesses gathered, the fire in the hearth burned high. Edgifu arrived in ritual silence, draped in a dark wool cloak. Her face was hidden by a veil spun in coarse linen, not unusual for a bride. She did not speak, nor resist, nor retreat. She sat when asked, as was expected, but the silence was too still. When prompted to extend her hand, a gesture symbolizing the transition of guardianship, she held it clenched. When instructed to kneel beside Wulfric during the blessing of the fire, she stood unmoving. The priest, untrained in disruption, continued the rites as if nothing had occurred. A woman's passivity was typical, but Idgiva's stillness was deliberate, confrontational, like a statue that refused to be carved. What happened next was unexpected. According to monastic records, Wulfric later appealed to the Hundred Court, claiming the marriage was valid and asking for immediate control over Idgifu's dour lands. But her father, an unusually educated man for the time, disputed the claim. In his testimony, he argued that Idgifu's silence had not indicated consent, but rather the absence of it. He cited an obscure clause from the Doom Book, King Alfred's law code about coerced unions, and claimed that no consent freely given was visible nor implied. The court, likely composed of local elders and landholders, was divided. Some insisted that ritual silence was binding. Others, perhaps influenced by shifting Christian values, leaned toward the argument that a bride should not be forced through ceremony like cattle to slaughter in a rare outcome. The marriage was annulled, not on grounds of consummation or illegitimacy, but on the basis that ritual silence could not always stand for consent. Idgifu's case did not ignite a revolution. There was no sudden change in marital customs, no sweeping reform, but her defiance, a defiance rendered entirely through stillness, echoed in small ways. Within decades, Christian commentators began urging more explicit verbal consent during the handfasting stage. Some even required the bride to say yes, Gia, a Norse-influenced term that began filtering into Saxon dialects. The Church, ever concerned with the sanctity of marriage, saw this as a moral improvement, and in areas where monastic influence grew strong, records began noting brides as willing or unwilling, a bureaucratic but telling shift. For women who did not dare to imitate Idgifu's resistance openly, the monastery became a loophole. Saxon law, particularly under King Alfred and King Edward the Elder, allowed young women to enter the church with a father's consent, even if they were betrothed. This became a quiet escape hatch. Several charters from the early 900s record land donations made in lieu of marriage, suggesting that daughters had taken vows of chastity in exchange for a spiritual dowry to a nearby abbey, once cloistered. A woman could not be forcibly married. She was now bride of Christ and, more importantly, legally unavailable to secular marriage arrangements. There was, in essence, a hidden form of protest available. Exchange your silence for a different kind of vow. Still, these were exceptions. For most women, the silence remained unchallenged. Even as church courts gained prominence and canon law emphasized free will, local traditions, especially in rural hundreds, enforced the old ways. In remote villages, the ritual of the silent bride endured well into the 11th century. In some regions, speaking during a wedding was considered a bad omen for the entire household. A bride who stammered or sobbed might be accused of bringing misfortune, of inviting sterility, sickness, or worse, silence became not only a legal fiction, but a superstition, a necessary hush that blanketed generations of women who whispered resistance only in locked kitchens or over dye pots with their mothers. It's tempting to paint Gifu as a proto-feminist hero, a woman who seized her voice through silence. But history warns us, individual defiance is not always revolution. Her story flickered, then disappeared. The next generation likely returned to custom. Perhaps even Gifu herself, older, wearier, married quietly a decade later, choosing strategic compliance over open defiance. But something had shifted in court annals. Scribes began recording phrases like "she gave her yes" or "she did not contest." These additions were subtle bureaucratic habits rather than ideological declarations, but they marked a cultural tremor. A world built on ritual silence was beginning to murmur. The wedding hall is quieter than the church, but not because people are listening. It's quiet because tradition demands it. And for centuries, that quiet wasn't just the backdrop of medieval weddings. It was their binding force. But silence, like any law or ritual, is not permanent. As the Saxon era waned and the Norman tide surged across the British Isles, a new legal order, a new theology, and a new cultural imagination began reshaping how people understood marriage, consent, and ceremony. What was once assumed, a bride's stillness as compliance, began to be questioned. The silent bride would not vanish all at once, but she would, eventually, be given voice. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought more than castles and French surnames. It introduced a legal system rooted in written evidence, hierarchical order, and royal oversight. Under Norman influence, marriage was increasingly treated as a contractual bond, not just a familial right. In Saxon tradition, marriage had been more communal, involving local kin, local priests, and customs that varied regionally. The bride's silence was understood contextually, often bolstered by what her father said on her behalf. Under Norman law, however, a marriage required explicit consent, not just from the father or guardian, but from the individuals themselves. The Church, now wielding greater influence, leaned heavily on canon law, which demanded mutual willingness. And how do you prove willingness? With words by the 12th century, canon lawyers like Gratian, whose decretum became the cornerstone of ecclesiastical law, codified the rule that mutual consent, expressed verbally, constituted a valid marriage. The public ritual became less about silent transfer and more about declared union. No consent, no marriage, the Church now insisted. It was a theological pivot. Marriage was no longer simply an exchange of property or protection. It became a sacrament, a holy bond, and thus required the conscious assent of both souls involved. Now, the bride was expected to speak. Some resisted this shift, especially in rural parishes. Older customs died hard, especially those that preserved male control. But with increasing church presence, particularly through monastic expansion and episcopal courts, the norm slowly changed. In wedding sermons, priests began asking brides directly, will this man to be your husband? And while many still trembled or wept, they were no longer allowed to remain silent. Churches were once incidental to weddings. Early Saxon unions took place at home or in the hall, practical locations where contracts could be enforced. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, marriages moved increasingly into the sanctified space of the church. With that move came new expectations, ritual clarity, priestly oversight, and public pronouncement. The banns of marriage, which required the announcement of upcoming unions for 3 consecutive Sundays, were introduced to prevent secret, forced, or invalid marriages. This reinforced the notion that marriage was a public affair, not a private arrangement. In this context, bride silence became problematic. If a woman could not or would not declare her consent before the altar, priests were instructed to halt the ceremony. This might seem obvious now, but at the time it was revolutionary. Still, traditions do not vanish with edicts. The ritual of the silent bride lingered in folk practices, especially in isolated communities and among lower nobility, where property considerations dominated personal choice. In some northern villages, brides were still expected to remain mute until after consummation. Well into the 13th century, not by law, but by custom, the myth that speaking on the wedding day could curse the bed or anger the dead persisted. Ballads from the period describe the white bride with quiet lips, or maidens who marry without a word. These poetic echoes remind us that silence held a strange romance in the medieval mind, a mixture of obedience, chastity, and mystery. But even this aesthetic began to shift. By the 14th century, the consent at the church door, a formal declaration before entering the chapel, became standard in England. This phrase would eventually evolve into the modern, "Do you take this man, woman?" The bride now had a moment in the ritual designed specifically for her voice. The growth of literacy also changed the equation. As more people, especially among the upper classes, learned to read and write, legal disputes about marriage began involving letters, witnesses, and written vows. The bride's voice was no longer solely oral. She could write to contest a union. She could draft a vow. In some cases, she could appeal to bishops or even the crown. One well-preserved example is the letter of Matilda of Hereford, written in 1279, contesting a marriage arranged without her consent. She wrote, "I was there, but my tongue was not. I stood, but I did not yield. My silence was fear, not favor." The court ruled in her favor. It was one of many cases where a woman's voice, once assumed to be irrelevant, became a tool of legal defense. Today, when a bride speaks her vows in front of a gathered assembly, the moment feels ceremonial, even sweet. But that utterance is the product of a centuries-long evolution from silence to speech. Even now, echoes of the old customs linger. In some cultures, brides are still expected to be reserved, quiet, solemn. The idea of the demure, voiceless bride may be fading, but it remains embedded in global wedding aesthetics. The covered face, the lowered eyes, the silence before the kiss. And of course, there are still arranged marriages today where consent is assumed, coerced, or dismissed, just as it was in Saxon halls 1,000 years ago. In that way, the silent bride has not disappeared. She has simply changed forms. The silence of Saxon brides was never just about peace. It was about control, the appearance of obedience, the illusion of agreement. In some cases, it was survival. In others, submission. Sometimes it was a tool cleverly wielded, but mostly it was expected. We now live in a world that values voice, or claims to. But when we ask, "Do you take this man?" we are echoing a history where that question was never asked. it's worth remembering. Asking is a radical act, and answering even more so when you think of a wedding. Today, you might imagine vows under a flowered arch, or perhaps a first dance lit by soft candlelight. But if you were alive in medieval Europe, say between the 11th and 14th centuries, you would have seen none of that. Instead, you'd likely see a long negotiation between two families, tables covered with scrolls and seals, and livestock being led out to waiting carts. Perhaps a stretch of pasture land changing hands. Not love, not romance, just land and contracts. Marriage, for most of history, wasn't about emotion. It was about inheritance. It was a legal structure to determine who got what when. And in that world, the dowry wasn't a gift. It was the cost of entry into the institution of marriage, and the bride, quite literally, was the vehicle of transfer. The dowry, or dowse in Latin, was a transfer of wealth from the bride's family to the groom or his household. This could be land, money, livestock, clothing, jewels, or, in some regions, even villages with the people living in them. It was not a wedding present. It was a transactional guarantee. The bride's family provided this wealth to compensate the groom for the cost of maintaining her, and more importantly, to secure her status and safety in her new home. The wealth was technically hers, but in practice, it was managed by her husband or his kin. If the husband died, the dowry was often the only claim the woman had to a continued livelihood. This structure was especially rigid in Italy, France, and the Byzantine Empire, where legal systems formalized marriage into a near-corporate merger. In these places, love was something that came after marriage, if it came at all, by the 12th century. Noble families began using dowries as political leverage. A well-dowered daughter could marry up, perhaps into a higher noble house or even royalty. Her dowry bought her entrance into powerful lineages, but this also created a problem. Only wealthy families could afford to marry their daughters well. Poor families struggled to marry their daughters at all, while wealthy houses sometimes had to go into debt to secure a prestigious match. In Florence, during the 1300s, records show that some families spent over half their wealth on a single daughter's dowry. Dowries then became a form of social investment, a way to climb, or at least hold onto, one's place in the brutal feudal hierarchy. It wasn't uncommon for a father with 3 daughters to choose only one to marry well, investing all his dowry resources in her. The others might be sent to convents, not out of piety, but because monastic life was cheaper than marriage. Dowry negotiations were often more extensive than the marriage ceremony itself. The agreements were recorded in formal contracts, sealed, witnessed, and archived. In many cases, the bride's name appears only once. The rest is land measurements, livestock counts, or weight in silver coins. Some contracts included penalty clauses. If the groom mistreated his wife, he might have to return the dowry, or part of it, in disgrace. In others, the groom's family could demand additional payments if the wife turned out to be infertile. You see, the dowry wasn't just a gift. It was collateral. In medieval Spain, for instance, brides who failed to produce heirs within a set number of years could see their dowry forfeit, especially if the land attached to it was conditional. And in Byzantine law, a bride's dowry was considered the only part of the inheritance she would ever receive. She had no right to her father's estate after marriage. Her dowry was her future. Consider the story of Eleonora di Ferretta, a merchant's daughter from Padua, 1372. Her father, Pietro, negotiated a generous dowry, including a silk mill, to vineyards, and a sizable sum in Venetian ducats. The match was considered ideal. The groom, Lorenzo, was a younger son of minor nobility, handsome, educated, and upwardly mobile. But within 6 months, the marriage deteriorated. Lorenzo mistreated Eleonora, spent her dowry recklessly, and reportedly carried on with other women. When Eleonora returned to her father's house in tears, Pietro invoked a clause in the contract demanding return of the dowry. Lorenzo refused. The case went to arbitration, not uncommon at the time, and the judge ruled that while the dowry could not be returned in full, the vineyards were to be reclaimed by Eleonora's family. There's no record of what happened to her afterward, but her name appears again 10 years later as abbess of a convent outside Verona, likely unmarried, likely disillusioned, and likely no longer for sale. Not all was bleak. For some women, a large dowry could mean influence and autonomy. In elite households, women who entered marriage with considerable wealth often had their dowries partially set aside as personal spending money, known as pin money in later centuries. In rare cases, dowries funded hospitals, chapels, or even schools, not because women had control, but because their wealth was passed through marriage into the hands of men who did in Italian city-states. Some dowries were used to create family trusts that allowed women's children to inherit specific assets, particularly in households where intergenerational wealth was managed like a proto-bank. So yes, dowries created constraints, but they also, paradoxically, created the foundation for the female presence in economic life. They were both a trap and a tool. We often ask, when did people start marrying for love? Perhaps a better question is, when did they stop marrying for land? For over 1,000 years, marriages were explicitly economic exchanges, and the dowry was at the center of it all. Romance, if it arrived, came long after the livestock was tallied and the scrolls sealed. To be a bride was to be a contract, not a companion, a vehicle for wealth redistribution, a line item in a ledger. And yet, many of these women found ways to navigate their circumstances. Some built influence within their new households. Some used their dowries to protect children, fund dowries for younger sisters, or, in rare cases, negotiate second marriages on better terms. But the question remains, what did it feel like to stand at the altar, knowing that love had nothing to do with why you were there? By the 15th century, Florence was no longer the gritty, fractured city-state of earlier medieval Italy. It had transformed into a hub of trade, art, and innovation, the epicenter of the Renaissance. Its streets rang with the clang of metal, the rustle of parchment, and the soft hush of secrets whispered in candlelit chapels. Yet behind the gilded frescoes and marble statues, behind the poetic treatises and philosophical debates, Florence was still a city ruled by contracts. And none were more meticulously engineered than marriage dowry agreements. In Florence, love wasn't just bought, it was collateralized. Unlike feudal regions, where dowries were negotiated informally, Florence turned the dowry into an institution, a measurable, predictable, and regulated financial product. By the mid-1400s, Dowries were managed not just by families, but by dowry banks, known as Monte dei Doti, public institutions where a father could deposit a sum for his daughter. Years before she was even of marrying age, the dowry was invested over time. When the daughter came of age, the matured dowry was transferred to her future husband, often with interest. Think about that for a moment. A girl's future was not only planned in advance, it was invested. Before she could write her name, she was being priced. Florence was, quite literally, banking on brides. The Monte dei Doti Dowry Fund was established in 1425 to help stabilize the economy and encourage population growth through marriage. Here's how it worked. A father would deposit a set amount for his daughter, typically between 50 and 200 florins. The fund would grow over time, accruing interest at a fixed rate. When the daughter married, usually between ages 14 to 18, the city would pay the matured sum to her husband as her official dowry. This system had several advantages for the state. It encouraged early marriage, helping population stability. It provided the government with a steady stream of cash, as dowry funds couldn't be withdrawn early. It formalized the process, reducing dowry fraud or disputes, but it also commodified daughters in a new, chilling way. Now, a girl's marital prospects were tied not only to her father's status, but also to his financial foresight and the city's financial health. If the state defaulted, which it sometimes did, the daughter's dowry disappeared. Among noble and merchant families, dowries were used with surgical precision to build dynasties. Marrying into the right family could elevate one's political position, gain access to guild privileges, or cement loyalty between feuding houses. Take the Medici family, Florence's banking magnates and de facto rulers. When Lorenzo de' Medici arranged the marriage of his daughter Lucretia to Jacopo Salviati, he ensured her dowry included not only florins, but also landholdings and silk trading rights. This marriage wasn't about companionship, it was about extending the Medici grip into new sectors of the economy. Marriage was diplomacy, the dowry was the treaty, and even in the upper echelons of power, daughters were pawns, valuable pawns. Yes, but pawns all the same in Renaissance Florence. A woman's social value was often calculated with terrifying precision. Marriage contracts, most of which still survive in Florentine archives, read like property agreements. They detail the size and type of dowry in gold land, or commercial shares payment schedules conditions, under which the dowry must be returned, for example, divorce, death, the inclusion of trousseau's clothing, jewelry, furniture. Clause regarding heirs or infertility. The bride's name, again, is often buried beneath these details. She is the vessel, not the subject. In some contracts, there are even clauses about the moral behavior expected of the bride if she were accused of adultery or disobedience. The dowry could be seized. In short, not only did her family pay to marry her off, they risked losing that payment if she displeased her husband. Consider the tragic story of Isabetta Corsini, the daughter of a well-known wool merchant. Her dowry, invested in the Monte dei Doti, matured to a sizable sum by the time she was 16. She was married to Giuliano Bardi, a nobleman in need of cash flow for his vineyard operations. Within a year, Giuliano had used the dowry to cover debts, but when Isabetta failed to produce a child within 18 months, he filed for annulment. The court sided with him. Isabetta childless and divorced, was returned to her father's house. But her dowry remained with Giuliano. She later became a schoolmistress in a convent school, a position she could only afford because her mother secured a private annuity before marriage, separate from the dowry, a rare foresight. But for most women, that kind of protection was unavailable. By the early 1500s, Florence was struggling economically. Inflation rose, political instability rocked the city, and the Monte dei Doti began to default. Fathers who had deposited dowry funds never saw returns. Contracts were broken. Daughters could not marry without dowries, and many were instead cloistered again, not for religious conviction, but for economic necessity. This crisis led to a sharp decline in marriage rates among merchant classes, and an increase in women forced into convents, whether they desired it or not. In a strange twist of fate, women whose dowries failed became victims of both capitalism and patriarchy. Dowry failures also sparked public scandals, especially when prominent families sued the state for lost funds. In one case, the Albizzi family claimed 100 gold florins had vanished, money set aside for their daughter's marriage. The court ruled in favor of the state, citing wartime expenditures. Their daughter, we know from secondary letters, lived out her life in a Benedictine convent, never married, never refunded. Perhaps the most haunting feature of Renaissance dowry systems is how fluidly women became liquid. They were bought, transferred, measured, invested, and devalued, all in the language of finance. Even their capacity to bear children was assessed like a crop yield. One Florentine banker famously advised his son, "Marry the girl with the better land, not the better laugh." In this system, romance wasn't dead. It had never existed, at least not in the paperwork, yet. We do find small pockets of rebellion, women who petitioned for better contracts, mothers who negotiated smaller dowries in exchange for greater household authority, and brides who delayed marriage until they could secure a say in where their dowry would go. Not many, but enough to notice. The dowry system didn't collapse in a single moment of reform. It wasn't outlawed in one sweeping edict, nor was it brought down by a revolt of brides tearing up marriage contracts in protest. Instead, it faded slowly under the weight of shifting ideologies, wars, economic crises, and a rising cultural belief that marriage, perhaps, ought to involve something as quaint as mutual affection. But before romance could emerge victorious, the dowry system had to be weakened, not just socially, but theologically, politically, and economically. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517, changed more than church doctrine. It reshaped family life. Martin Luther and other reformers rejected many Catholic teachings about marriage as a sacrament. Instead, they promoted marriage as a social contract between equals, at least in theory, governed by civic law rather than religious ritual. More importantly, they criticized the economic corruption surrounding marriage, including the dowry system in Lutheran regions like Saxony and parts of Scandinavia. Civil authorities began encouraging modest dowries, or even no dowry at all, especially for commoners. Marriage was to be based on compatibility and shared purpose, not financial exchange. Of course, this didn't eliminate economic considerations, but it did begin to erode the assumption that a woman must come with a price tag in Geneva. John Calvin instituted laws limiting extravagant dowries and declared that a man could not reject a bride simply because her dowry was too small. These early Protestant policies were some of the first legal attempts to scale back the monetization of marriage. As Europe plunged into a century of war, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, the English Civil War, the Franco-Spanish conflicts, land was lost, noble lines were shattered, and dynastic marriages became less viable in this climate. Dowries shrank, not by choice, but by necessity. Families ruined by war could no longer afford large dowries, and in some cases, powerful men began marrying wealthy merchant women, whose dowries offered financial salvation to crumbling estates, a reversal of earlier class dynamics. In England and parts of France, we begin to see marriage advertisements in local newspapers. These often focused on character, religion, and education, and though wealth was still mentioned, it was no longer the sole defining trait of the bride. Slowly, personality began entering the conversation. In England, one of the key developments was the rise of the jointure, a legal settlement made by the groom's family on the bride, guaranteeing her an income or property in case of widowhood. This replaced the dowry in many circles instead of the bride, bringing wealth into the husband's family. The husband now provided future security for the wife, a significant reversal of the power dynamic by the 17th century, especially in England. The idea of a marriage portion dowry was increasingly replaced by mutual settlements, and prenuptial contracts negotiated rights and protections, not just price. The bride, while still often voiceless in these deals, was now viewed as an individual with legal entitlements, especially among gentry and upwardly mobile merchant families. Cultural winds were also shifting. In the 18th century, satirical plays and novels began ridiculing dowry-driven marriages. In works by Molière, Congreve, and even Jane Austen a century later, characters who married purely for money were portrayed as greedy, foolish, or doomed to unhappiness. This was a subtle but important turn. Where once a wealthy dowry bride was the ideal, she now became a symbol of vanity or cold ambition. In Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Charlotte Lucas marries the absurd Mr. Collins for security, and though the act is rational, the reader is made to pity her. Elizabeth Bennet, with her meager dowry, is seen as virtuous for rejecting financial logic in favor of love. That narrative shift reflects a profound cultural change, the moralization of love. A woman no longer needed a heavy dowry to be desirable. She needed wit, charm, and character. Though Austen and others are quick to remind us that a little income didn't hurt. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, especially in Northern Europe, love matches became fashionable among the middle classes. The aristocracy still married for politics and land, but even among nobles, the ideal of affectionate companionship gained traction. The rise of Enlightenment philosophy, with its emphasis on individual liberty and personal choice, reinforced the idea that marriage should be freely chosen. In France, following the Revolution of 1789, dowries were no longer required by law, and revolutionary ideology stressed that all citizens, even women, in theory, had equal worth, regardless of wealth. In practice, money still mattered, but the language of romance became dominant. Marriage was no longer just a contract between families. It was a union between two hearts. even if the bank accounts still had to be discussed. Despite its decline in Europe, the dowry system never fully disappeared. In fact, it evolved, and in some places, it became more entrenched. In colonial settings, European powers exported dowry practices to India, Africa, and the Middle East, sometimes amplifying pre-existing traditions into more rigid, harmful systems. Even today, in parts of South Asia and North Africa, dowry remains a central and often dangerous feature of marriage. Reports of dowry-related violence, suicide, and extortion are common. Meanwhile, in the West, dowries have been replaced by bridal registries, prenups, and wedding budgets, modern systems of financial negotiation that still echo the idea that marriage is partly economic. And while few would say they marry for a dowry today, most understand that love alone is rarely enough to build a life. We may not call it a dowry anymore, but we still discuss assets, career prospects, inheritances, homes, and savings. The negotiation has simply moved from the village gate to the dining table or financial planner's office. The end of the dowry did not liberate marriage, not entirely, but it did open a new conversation about partnership, value, and mutual responsibility. Dowries made women into wealth. Their disappearance made space, however imperfectly, for women to become people. But the question lingers, like a ghost in the registry. If love has replaced land, then what do we really mean when we say, "What do you bring to the table?" Before vows were spoken, before feasts began, and before music filled the hall, there was water, cold, sometimes near freezing, poured from a clay pitcher over bare, trembling feet onto stones gathered from a river. This was not a baptism. It was a test in the medieval Slavic world, stretching from the Carpathian valleys through the Rus principalities and into the frigid Baltic forests. The ritual of bridal foot washing was more than a quaint folk custom. It was a symbolic trial, a rite of passage, and a public display of a bride's obedience, humility, and worthiness to enter her husband's home. And it was very, very cold. To understand this ritual, you must first understand where it came from. In early Slavic societies, particularly among the East and South Slavs, what we'd now call Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Serbia, and Bulgaria, marriage was a communal, village-oriented affair. It was deeply patriarchal, but laced with ancient, often pre-Christian symbolism. The household was sacred. The hearth, the oven, the threshold. These were not just architectural elements. They were spiritual boundaries. To cross them was to be absorbed, claimed, transformed. For a bride, entering a husband's house was akin to entering a different world. She would leave behind her name, her customs, and even her dialect in some cases. She became part of his clan, not just socially, but cosmologically. And so the transition had to be marked with water and stone and silence. The foot-washing ceremony typically occurred immediately after the wedding procession arrived at the groom's household. The bride, dressed in embroidered linen and ornate headwear, would step off the cart or sleigh and remove her shoes. This was done publicly, in front of the groom's family, neighbors, and village elders. The groom's mother, or a senior female relative, would bring out a clay basin of cold water, often infused with herbs like wormwood or juniper, both thought to ward off evil. River stones were placed at the threshold. The bride would then Step onto the stones barefoot, and the elder would pour the water over her feet. No fire, no towels, no shoes, just the cold seep of water, the slippery rock beneath her, and the eyes of a dozen villagers watching. In Slavic culture, the feet symbolized submission. To wash someone's feet, as seen in both Orthodox Christian and pagan traditions, was an act of humility. For the bride, it was both a symbolic cleansing of her past and a declaration of readiness to serve. The stones were more than props. They were drawn from nearby rivers and marked with runes or chalk. Some were passed down through generations, known as threshold stones, believed to absorb misfortune or neutralize curses. Stepping on them barefoot in public while being doused with cold water was not just uncomfortable. It was a ritualized humiliation designed to demonstrate grace under pressure. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was tradition. It was the social script of the community. A bride who flinched, cried, or stumbled might be whispered, "About 4 years." Interestingly, the groom rarely participated in the ritual. He would typically wait inside the house, prepared to greet his bride once the foot washing concluded. His absence was meaningful. In Slavic folk belief, the groom should not see the bride in a vulnerable or transitional state until the ritual was complete. She was still symbolically of the forest, of the river, or of the maiden world. Only once her feet were washed, once she was purified and quieted, could she cross the threshold into adult womanhood, wifehood, and domestic obligation. It was a way of saying, "You were wild. Now you are ours." After the foot washing, the bride would be wrapped in a new cloth, often one embroidered by the groom's female kin, and guided into the house, where a second ceremony took place, the removal of her vinok, or maidens. Wreath. The vinok was a floral crown worn only by unmarried women. Its removal was symbolic death, the end of girlhood. It would be replaced by a nomitka headscarf, or ochipak, married woman's cap. In some regions, the whetstones from the foot washing were buried at the doorway, sealing her fate and marking the site of her passage. In others, they were kept as talismans in the oven or root cellar, guardians against infertility and illness. The symbolism was layered and heavy, but beneath it all was a simple, stark message. You do not enter this life untested. You enter it cold, silent, and humbled. One of the most detailed surviving descriptions of the ritual comes from a 14th century Ruthenian marriage manuscript, which reads, "The bride shall not speak as the water falls. She shall not shiver, lest her future be frost. Her feet shall feel the river's truth. If she slips, the mother must scold her spirit back into place." Another account, from a 15th century Polish cleric who criticized the practice, noted, "They make the girl stand on stone like penitence. This is not Christian, though they claim it is. It is the old ways in disguise. She stands with frozen tears, and all call it good fortune." Despite church objections, the ritual persisted well into the 17th century in rural areas, and in some regions, modified versions survive to this day. To reject the ritual was unthinkable. A bride who refused to undergo foot washing might be accused of arrogance, witchcraft, or even demonic possession. In some communities, if the bride cried out during the ritual, it was believed that her first child would be stillborn. If she smiled, she was said to invite infidelity into the marriage. It was a narrow emotional corridor. One walked with chattering teeth and clenched resolve. But for many brides, especially those moving into unfamiliar households, it was also a public performance of strength, a declaration that they could endure, adapt, and survive from the outside. It seems like a strange and perhaps cruel custom, but it reflects a deeper historical truth. In a world where women had few choices, rituals provided structure, purpose, and even protection. The foot-washing ceremony was not just about obedience, it was about readiness, respect, and integration into a new world. It was a signal to the village that this woman would bear the burdens ahead and do so with grace. But still, we must ask, what did she feel, standing barefoot on river stones, while cold water slid down her legs, and her future waited silently behind the door? In the dim light of a Ruthenian dawn, sometime in the spring of 1461, a young girl named Daria stood at the edge of a village square with bare feet and trembling hands. She had been up before the roosters, dressed by her sisters, her hair coiled in elaborate braids tied with crimson thread, the color of transition, fertility, and warding. The wedding songs had already begun, but they were not joyful melodies. They were slow, low-toned chants, dirges more than celebrations. They sounded like morning dot, because, in many Slavic traditions, a wedding was a kind of funeral, a farewell to girlhood, a symbolic death before the rebirth into wifehood, motherhood, and servitude. Daria had known this was coming, but knowing didn't make it easier. Daria was the third daughter of a small-holding peasant family near Lviv, in a time when the Polish crown ruled over a patchwork of Ruthenian territories. Her family grew barley and raised geese. Her dowry, modest by any measure, consisted of a single wool cloak, a carved box, and a piglet. The groom, Mikla, was older, the son of a charcoal burner. His mother had recently died, and he needed a wife to tend to the house and eventually bear children to help with the forest work. There was no courtship, no exchange of love letters, just a quiet meeting between Daria's father and the village elder. A transaction, a date was set. The piglet was fed extra in anticipation, and now she was here, standing at the threshold of a stranger's home, where she was expected to wash her feet in silence. The elder women formed a half-circle, a basin of river water, ice still. Clinging to the rim was placed beside the doorway. Inside the basin, 3 stones lay still, polished smooth by decades of use. The eldest woman, a matron named Hannah, stepped forward. She was known as a keeper of rites, a woman who had washed the feet of at least 30 brides. With a stern expression, she pointed. Step forward. Daria's bare soles met the stones. Cold seeped upward through her bones. Then, with deliberate slowness, Hannah poured the water, starting from the left foot, then the right. Some of it splashed onto the stones, pooling around Daria's toes. Her face remained still. A whisper ran through the crowd. She doesn't flinch. Good. That would be remembered. But Daria's stillness wasn't strength. It was resignation. She had spent the night before this moment pressing herbs into her heels, trying to numb herself. Her aunt had taught her this trick, a secret taught in whispers between women, passed down through generations. A way to dull the sting and pass the test. And so she stood there, composed and dry-eyed, while inside she clenched every muscle she had. The ritual lasted less than a minute, and yet it was one of the only moments in the entire marriage ceremony that belonged entirely to the bride. This was the paradox. Though foot washing symbolized submission, It also gave the bride an opportunity, brief and subtle, to assert herself, to be witnessed by standing without flinching. A bride could send a message, "I am stronger than this." By shivering or sobbing, she might provoke pity, or worse, ridicule. In some villages, brides who failed the ritual were nicknamed whetstones, a term whispered in taverns and later carved into cruel folk songs. But Daria passed the test. Whether through herbal trickery or raw nerve, she presented the village with what it expected: silent fortitude. Yet what no one knew, not her sisters, not Hannah, not even her mother, was that Daria had a secret plan. Daria had long known her marriage would come. But what she had not known was that Mikola was known for anger. Villagers spoke of his temper with shrugs, as though it were simply a matter of weather. He drank. He struck his younger brother once so hard he broke a tooth. Daria had learned this only days before the wedding, but it changed everything. The escape wasn't literal. She didn't run. She knew where she'd end up if she did: dragged back and punished, her family fined, her name stained. Instead, Daria planned her own kind of escape within the marriage, not from it. She had secretly petitioned the village priest to give her reading lessons in the evenings. She told no one, not even her sisters. If she could read, she thought, perhaps she could eventually teach. And if she taught, perhaps she could earn. And if she earned, perhaps she could buy herself out. This was the slow rebellion, the quiet resistance, the only kind available. And so she endured the ritual, the cold, the silence, the laughter of boys nearby, because beyond it was a house. And in the corner of that house, a book she had once seen, sitting beneath a saint's icon, forgotten, dust-covered. She wanted it, not for prayers, for practice. Once the water had drained into the earth, Hannah stepped forward with a clean cloth, a towel woven with red thread and herbs. But Daria, in a small breach of custom, took the cloth herself. She did not wait to be dried. She bent, dried her own feet, and tied her sandals without assistance. It was small, but the gesture did not go unnoticed. Later, Hannah would mention it to Daria's mother. "She's proud." Not foolish, just proud. She needed, and she did. Within weeks, she was carrying water for the hearth, weaving in the evenings, and cooking for 3 men. Mikola rarely spoke and often drank, but he left her mostly alone, and each evening, when she could, she opened that book. She taught herself, slowly, by candlelight, until the letters no longer looked like carvings, but like keys. Daria's story is a reminder that rituals, even oppressive ones, are not fixed. They may be designed to humiliate or condition, but they are interpreted, re-encoded, and sometimes reclaimed. What began as a gesture of submission can become a private performance of endurance. What is intended to test obedience may instead nurture resolve. The foot-washing ritual, then, is not just about water or cold or shame. It's about the first moment a bride stands before her new world, visible, judged, but also capable of being more than what's expected. Daria's defiance was invisible to most, but for her it was everything. And in time, the village would say she never flinched, but they never knew why. No tradition ends abruptly. Customs fade the way old songs do, slowly, line by line, until what remains is more echo than form. The ritual of bridal foot-washing once stood as a defining feature of marriage across the Slavic world, from the steppes of Ruthenia to the meadows of Bohemia. but by the 18th century, the cold stones were less frequently brought out. The water was no longer drawn from sacred rivers, and the younger generation began to whisper, "Why should she stand there like that at all?" Yet traces remain, not just in rural pockets of Eastern Europe, but in modern ceremonies, in family, folklore, and even in the emotional choreography of weddings today. This final section explores how the ritual declined, how it was repurposed or suppressed, and how its quiet, icy symbolism still lingers in different clothing, but with familiar intent. The Orthodox Church, and later the Catholic clergy in Slavic regions, often took a dim view of folk customs. Anything involving stones, herbs, or ancestral spirits was viewed as pagan residue, even if it had been reinterpreted through a Christian lens. Foot washing, while superficially compatible with the biblical tale of Christ washing the disciples' feet, was never quite embraced when performed by peasant matriarchs using river charms and whispered rhymes. In diocesan records from Galicia and Moravia during the 17th century, priests explicitly condemned foot washing as superstitious, warning parishioners not to partake in rituals that were not sanctioned by Holy Mother Church. Some parishes even imposed penalties for hosting such ceremonies. The local bishop in Vilnius declared in 1708, "Let no woman pour water on her daughter's feet in place of confession. Let no bride stand barefoot before her husband's door, as if entering a temple of false gods." And yet, the people persisted in more isolated villages, especially in the Carpathians and among the Lemko and Hutsul peoples. The ritual was quietly adapted. Instead of public ceremonies, mothers would wash their daughters' feet in private, behind closed doors, just before the procession. The symbolism remained, but it was hidden, secret, sacred. By the 19th century, the ritual had softened in tone. The cold water and stones were replaced by warm basins scented with rosewater. The act became more tender, less of a test, more of a farewell gesture between mother and daughter. Instead of public shaming, it became a private moment of bonding. In some regions, it evolved into what's now called the bride's preparation, where older women help the bride wash, dress, and bless herself before the wedding. The harsh, humiliating tone faded, but the emotional architecture remained intact. A moment of vulnerability, symbolic cleansing, emotional threshold crossed. The ritual had lost its stones, but not its weight. Today, few people know the history behind these customs, yet echoes persist in unexpected places. In many Eastern European weddings, there are still rituals in which the bride sits while her feet are touched, adorned, or symbolically prepared. In some Bulgarian villages, brides walk barefoot to the church as a sign of purity and humility. In parts of Ukraine and Poland, it's still common for the bride's feet to be blessed with oil or touched with linen woven by her mother or grandmother. And in Western weddings, far removed from Slavic tradition, the phrase "cold feet" is often used to describe wedding anxiety. It's likely coincidental, but poetic nonetheless. What was once literal, standing barefoot on ice-chilled stones, has become metaphorical, but the tension remains. The fear of change, the dread of expectation, the ache of becoming someone else. Though the public ritual has mostly disappeared, its memory lives on in folktales, oral histories, and family anecdotes. Grandmothers whisper stories of how they stood on stones without a word, Aunties recall how their mothers wept in secret. After the ritual, some even keep the stones passed down like heirlooms, smoothed by time, hidden in drawers or flower beds. There are stories of brides who pretended to faint just to delay the inevitable. Stories of girls who hid charms in their shoes to counter the power of the stones. Stories of brides who smiled defiantly despite the warnings. The stories matter. They are the afterlife of ritual, and in them we hear not just submission, but resistance, adaptation, cleverness, and pride in many ways. The ritual of foot washing is a mirror reflecting whatever society expects from women at the point of marriage. In earlier centuries, it was obedience, later, humility, now perhaps self-reflection. But the themes endure: cleansing, entry, transformation. The idea that before a woman joins her new life, she must be examined, proven, or at the very least, seen. It forces the question, why do our wedding rituals still focus so heavily on the bride's transformation and not the groom's? Why is it her purity, her behavior, her composure that is tested? What stones are modern brides still standing on, and how many know why? The foot-washing ritual may no longer be practiced, but its spirit lingers. It's in the way we speak about wedding day nerves, in the symbolic giving away of the bride, in the bridal shower where older women prepare her, in the expectation that she will glide across thresholds with grace. Even if her feet ache, the stones are gone. The water has warmed, but the silence, that pregnant public silence, is still expected. And perhaps, one day, even that will wash away too. She couldn't read, she couldn't write. Her legs were barely strong enough to climb the stairs of the stone keep. And yet, she was married in the world of medieval aristocracy. Childhood was a fleeting phase, often shortened not by death, but by contract. 4 noble girls born into privilege, wealth, or proximity to royal blood. Marriage didn't wait for maturity. It came with a document, a dowry, and sometimes a veil, all before her first permanent tooth. To be a noble girl in 12th or 13th century Europe was to live on a schedule set not by age or readiness, but by political necessity. The earlier you were wed, the faster your family could solidify alliances. And so, many were married at 7, 6, or even 5 years old, and no one asked if they understood what that meant. Let's clarify. Marrying a child in medieval Europe did not always mean consummating the union immediately. In many legal traditions, both canon law and secular codes, the age of consent for consummation was typically around 12 for girls, 14 for boys. But this technicality did little to ease the reality that girls were married as legal wives far earlier in practice. Marriage at this age meant that the child was formally transferred to the household of her husband's family. She would live there, often raised by her mother-in-law or tutors, and trained in the ways of her future role. Her name changed, her title changed, and most importantly, her fate was sealed. Marriage wasn't a future prospect, it was a present condition. She was a wife, in name, in law, in purpose. Canon law, deeply influential across Catholic Europe, held that marriages contracted under the legal age of consent were valid so long as there was no protest. If both parties reached the age of consent and didn't object, the marriage became indissoluble. That gave noble families a convenient loophole: marry the children early. Let them grow into it. and if either party resisted later, too late. Even papal dispensations were often granted to lower the age of marriage, especially for royal houses or diplomatic alliances. The Church, though cautious in public, was remarkably flexible in private when it came to politics. After all, marriage was less a sacrament than a strategic alliance. The pressure to marry daughters young was rooted in lineage. For noble families, inheritance and legitimacy were paramount. The goal was to tie one's house to another through shared land, title, and blood. The sooner the betrothal, the sooner those ties could be secured. A young girl brought to a husband's court was shaped like clay, molded into his family's culture, language, and priorities. There was also fear. A daughter allowed to grow to old might develop opinions, or worse, she might fall in love outside of her station. A child of 7, by contrast, offered no resistance. She was pliant. Unformed marriage neutralized that risk. It claimed her before she could claim herself. Consider Jeanne of France, daughter of King Louis XI. Born in 1464, she was married at age 12 to her cousin Louis, Duke of Orleans, a match arranged when she was just 8. The marriage was politically advantageous but personally tragic. Louis despised Jeanne, mocked her appearance, and refused to consummate the marriage for years. When he became King Louis XII, he sought an annulment, claiming coercion and lack of consent. The Church eventually granted it. Jeanne, deeply devout, retired to a convent and later founded the Order of the Annunciation. But she never chose any of it. Not the marriage, not the annulment, not the convent. Her life, like many noble girls, was shaped by other people's decisions. Long before she understood the stakes, most child brides did not share a bed with their husbands, not at first. Instead, they were assigned governesses, servants, and tutors who prepared them for their eventual role. But this was no childhood paradise. These girls were expected to behave as future wives. They learned estate management, etiquette, embroidery, and the basics of religious observance. In some households, they were used to strengthen the husband's claim, paraded at court as a sign of his alliance with another noble house. In some cases, child brides were even punished or shamed for childish behavior. Crying, playing, or forgetting formal greetings could result in reprimands or loss of privileges. They were children forced to rehearse adulthood. The long years between marriage and consummation were not idle. They were conditioning years. A child bride was taught her role not just through words, but through example and expectation. She watched her mother-in-law serve in silence. She saw other women punished for disobedience. She internalized the rhythms of submission. And when she reached 12, 13, or 14, and her body began to change, she knew what came next. Not because anyone told her, but because everything had been leading there. We don't have many direct accounts from these girls. They left few letters, fewer memoirs, and almost no legal testimony. But what we do have are glimpses. A prayer journal from a 13th century Castilian princess who wrote about being sent away while still in my mother's arms. A poem by a Hungarian countess recalling my games interrupted by veils. A letter from a young bride to her brother. I cannot yet read. They say I will learn before I am summoned to the bed. These fragments suggest not rebellion, but quiet confusion, a sense of being moved like a chess piece across a board, whose rules they did not understand. Child brides of the nobility were not anomalies. They were standard practice, expected and applauded. Their weddings were celebrations of alliance, even as they stood there, arms too short for the sleeves of their gowns. Their lives remind us that marriage has not always been about love, maturity, or choice. Sometimes it was about who got to claim you first. And so we must ask, how young is too young when power and politics are at stake? And who gets to answer that question if the bride cannot? In the candlelit corridors of medieval palaces, the wedding bed waited, untouched. And in another room, quiet, curtained, and carefully watched, a child wife slept, or tried to, surrounded by books she could not yet read and prayers she did not yet understand. Time was ticking in noble households across medieval Europe. The delay between a child's wedding and the consummation of marriage created an eerie in-between space, a place where a girl was not a child, not yet a woman, but legally a wife. This waiting period, while sometimes protective, was often fraught with anxiety, pressure, and ritualized intrusion. Her body was being watched, not for signs of sickness, but for signs of readiness. And when the time came, there would be no escape. Once a child bride arrived at her husband's home, her life often revolved around preparation and observation. She might be assigned to a lady-in-waiting, sometimes even her future mother-in-law, who would supervise her manners, education, hygiene, and physical development. These women were not gentle tutors. Their job was to ensure that the girl would be ready, mentally and physically, when summoned in larger courts. Physicians were sometimes consulted to predict the girl's first menstruation, which was often interpreted as the signal of reproductive viability. If she had not yet bled, the marriage would remain unconsummated. But once she did, the door opened. Some girls were as young as 11. It is difficult to overstate how deeply the female body was monitored in this waiting period. Letters from noble households reveal the frank and unsettling tone of such discussions. For example, "My daughter now shows the signs of flowering. I have informed His Grace, and he shall be prepared by winter." A 15th century English nobleman, writing to his son-in-law, this from a court physician in Burgundy: "Her skin has grown pale and even, her eyes sharp and quiet. Her walk is steady. I believe her womanhood to be near." This wasn't admiration. It was assessment, as if the girl were a crop nearing harvest. Even clergy were involved. Priests blessed the marriage daily, urging divine guidance over the girls. Body monks debated in theological texts whether natural ripening was enough to justify consummation before the canonical age. Some concluded that biological signs overruled calendar years. It was all quite legal, but far from moral. In many courts, the consummation night was a public matter, not physically public, but ceremonially observed. Let's take the case of Isabella of Valois, married at age 6 to King Richard II of England in 1396. At the time of their marriage, she was treated with honor and affection, but not touched due to her age. Richard himself stated, "I will wait until she be of age to know me." They shared a household, but separate chambers, and yet, when Isabella turned 12, letters flew between England and France, discussing when and how the marriage should be consummated, as if her body were a diplomatic clock ticking toward a treaty deadline. In many noble weddings, the consummation was followed by a bedding ceremony, where witnesses Often older women or chambermaids would attend to the couple, dress them, and lead them to the bed. Sometimes the couple was watched. Other times, the sheets were examined the next morning for blood, as proof of both virginity and consummation. These rituals weren't private. They were political theater, and the bride, a silent player in a drama written long before her birth to prepare girls for their duties. There existed manuals and guides for noble women, written by men. Of course, one 14th century French book advised, a young wife should not speak boldly, nor laugh freely. She must submit to her lord's desire, as she does to her God. Another stated, if she cries, she should be comforted with gifts, but her resistance must not halt the ritual. Instructional poems even circulated in aristocratic circles. The Roman de la Rose, a popular allegorical text, used veiled metaphors to describe sexual initiation as a conquest. Obscure nobles. Some of the most famous women in history were married off in childhood. Catherine de Valois, betrothed at 3, married to King Henry V at 13. Widowed and pregnant at 14, Margaret Beaufort, married at 12, gave birth to Henry VII. At 13, Anne of Brittany, married at 14 to King Charles VIII of France, after being betrothed multiple times since early childhood. In all these cases, the girls were moved like assets, without regard for their own voices. Even in the rare case where a marriage was delayed or annulled, it was never for the girls' benefit, only for political convenience. Still, some girls found ways to delay. In a case from 1314, a young Hungarian noblewoman feigned illness for over a year to avoid consummation. Her physicians, sympathetic, diagnosed her with a delicate constitution, buying her time. Another girl in Bohemia claimed religious devotion and convinced her father to allow her 3 more years of prayer before consummation. She eventually entered a convent instead, with the help of her brother, who bribed her husband's steward. These are rare exceptions, but they suggest that some girls understood the system and could play within its margins. Medical records from medieval and early modern periods reveal the grim consequences of early consummation. High rates of death in childbirth, especially among girls under 15, pelvic injuries and deformities from intercourse and pregnancy before full physical maturity, psychological trauma. Often masked under the vague term melancholia, doctors wrote of ghostly brides, young girls who never smiled, who stopped speaking, who withered in court chambers until they were forgotten. Some survived, fewer thrived, but many were simply consumed by the very role they were given before they could grow into it. Today, we associate marriage with readiness, emotional, financial, personal. We delay marriage, often into our late 20s or 30s, waiting to feel prepared. But for centuries, the bride's readiness didn't matter. She was ready when her father said so, when her body changed, when the calendar aligned with a political need. And so we ask, if time is a gift we now grant ourselves, how many lives have been lived without ever receiving it? There was a time when a girl's 7th birthday wasn't marked by toys or school books, but by a betrothal contract, a priest's blessing, and a promise that her body, once grown, would belong to another dot, and for centuries no one questioned it. But over time, slow, uneven, and tangled with resistance, the notion of girlhood as a distinct and protected stage of life began to take shape. not in the halls of royal courts, not in the ledgers of marriage brokers, but in legal codes, philosophical texts, religious reforms, and the cries of women who remembered what it was to lose childhood before it had even begun. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, age of consent laws began to solidify across parts of Europe, spurred partly by Reformation ideals and partly by increasing concern over inheritance abuses and marriage fraud. In Protestant regions, particularly in Northern Europe, reformers began advocating that marriage required mature consent, not just legal, but spiritual and emotional. Martin Luther himself argued that young people should not be forced into marriage, especially not before they could understand the yoke they are to bear. In Catholic regions, canon law still permitted early marriage, technically allowing girls to be married at 12, but even the Church began urging delays. Papal letters from the 1600s show concern over unripened unions, especially when noble families sought to annul politically inconvenient matches. Secular courts, too, got involved in France. Under the influence of Enlightenment thinkers, age of consent was gradually raised. By the time of the Napoleonic Code in the early 19th century, minimum ages for marriage were officially codified: 15 for girls, 18 for boys still young by modern standards. But for many, this was an enormous leap forward with the spread of literacy, printing, and philosophical inquiry. The 18th century saw a profound shift in how childhood, and by extension, protected stage of innocence and development. His novel, Emile 1762, argued that education should reflect the stages of life, that children should not be rushed into adult roles. Even though Rousseau's own personal actions undermined his philosophy, he abandoned his children. His ideas changed public conversation. For noble daughters, this meant a growing emphasis on education before marriage. Tutors were hired not just to teach embroidery or piety, but reading, history, and music. Early feminist voices began to emerge. Faint but persistent. Writers like Mary Austell in England and Christine de Pizan in France questioned the morality of early marriage. Christine asked in 1405, "How can a girl obey a husband when she has not yet learned to govern herself?" Her question would echo for centuries. The Industrial Revolution brought more than factories and pollution. It altered family structures, delayed marriage, and raised the value of education, especially in the middle classes. As families moved into cities and became dependent on wage labor, daughters were no longer married off to secure land. Instead, they were kept at home longer, working in shops, learning trades. Middle-class values emphasized the protected daughter, modest, innocent, sheltered until her early 20s. The home became a place of child-centered morality, and the girl child became a symbol of virtue, not a pawn of politics. For the first time in European history, to be a girl was to be temporarily exempt from marriage, though once complicit in child marriage. The Church, both Catholic and Protestant, began adapting to the new world. By the 19th century, most Christian denominations in Europe officially supported raising the marriage age, and premarital education became common among elite parishes. Some clergy even began blessing engagements only after puberty, a sharp departure from the centuries-old tradition of toddler betrothals. But the shift was far from universal. In rural areas and aristocratic circles, child marriage persisted quietly well into the 1800s. Many noble families continued to contract marriages by age 10 or 11, often hiding them behind layers of ceremony and delayed consummation. Legal reforms took time, but cultural change, once it started, could not be stopped by the late 19th century. Across most of Europe, the idea of marrying off a 7-year-old was not just old-fashioned, it was scandalous, but some ceremonial echoes remained. Royal children were still betrothed young, though marriages were rarely finalized until late adolescence. Political treaties still referenced marriage alliances, but these were often symbolic, not binding. The title of child wife became more historical curiosity than lived experience, though in colonial contexts, child marriage remained disturbingly common. Generation of European child brides, their lives straddling to eras. Today, in most of Europe, the idea of marrying a child is illegal, unthinkable, a human rights violation. But it's worth remembering, this change did not come from nowhere. It came from the slow, painful accumulation of stories, the prayers of girls like Jeanne of France, the secret lessons of Daria the peasant, the veiled defiance of noble daughters who learned to read their contracts before they lived them, came from education, from protest, from time. It came because someone, somewhere, began to say, "This is too soon. This is too much. Let her be a child." Marriage at 7 was never about love. It was about timing, control, and the transfer of property through daughters. But the end of child marriage was not just a legal victory. It was the invention of a new idea, that childhood matters, that girlhood is not a waiting room, but a room of its own, and that no contract, no crown, and no kingdom should take it away before it's lived. It wasn't enough to find a partner, it wasn't enough to love them, and it certainly wasn't enough to say yes. In medieval Europe, love required authorization, stamped, spoken, and sanctified by the Church. Without it, love was not only invalid, it was a crime. Marriage, in the eyes of the medieval Church, was not simply a social contract, it was a sacrament, governed by ecclesiastical law, which meant that every step from announcement to consummation had to be visible, approved, and documented. And if you tried to marry without it, you might face banishment, excommunication, or public penance. This is the story of how the medieval Church inserted itself into the most personal of choices, and how it used bans, Bibles, and bureaucracy to claim control over marriage in ways that still shape law and custom today. For much of early medieval history, roughly pre-9th century, marriage was a domestic affair. Families arranged matches, property exchanged hands, and rituals, both pagan and Christian, were performed in the home. But by the 11th century, the Church began to assert its role as the arbiter of all sacramental life, including marriage. Pope Alexander III, reigned 1159 to 1181, famously declared that marriage was valid through mutual consent alone, and it did so through bans. The bans were a public announcement made from the pulpit of an upcoming marriage. Knows a just cause why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony. Let him speak now, or forever hold his peace. It was both a warning and an invitation to interfere. The purpose, to expose any hidden impediments. Were they too closely related? Was one already secretly married? Had either taken monastic vows? Were they attempting to marry across class, racial lines? If no one objected over the 3-week period, the wedding could proceed. If someone did, the couple would be forced to appear before a church court, explain themselves, and potentially have the union canceled or delayed. And these delays could stretch months or years during engaging sexually or appearing in public as man and wife. In the High Middle Ages, the Church also increased its control through biblical interpretation and marriage doctrine. Marriage was monogamous, indissoluble, hierarchical man over woman, governed by sacramental lut. And because most people were illiterate, they relied entirely on priests to interpret these rules for them. None may approach it unless clean of sin and known to the Church. In many regions, the diocese, the Church's administrative zone, had its own policies and priorities. What was permissible in one place might be condemned in another. In some parishes, inter-village marriages required written approval from 2 separate priests. In others, people were forced to marry within their village to preserve economic and spiritual unity in frontier zones, especially in Eastern Europe, or borderlands near Muslim kingdoms. The Church often scrutinized interfaith unions, and if you married without permission, you didn't just break a rule, you disrupted the moral fabric of Christendom. Church courts were often the most powerful legal bodies in a medieval Christian's life. They had jurisdiction over sins, contracts, morality, and marriage. People accused of unauthorized marriage were summoned before a bishop's court. These were not criminal courts. They had no dungeons, but they could excommunicate, fine, or sentence public penance. In one 13th century case in York, a couple was accused of marrying in a meadow without banns. The woman was fined, the man ordered to appear barefoot in church for 3 Sundays, wearing a sign that read, "I wed without grace." In another, the goal wasn't just to discipline, it was to shame. Secret marriages were surprisingly common. These were called clandestine marriages, but once exposed, they became ecclesiastical nightmares. Why? Because they opened the door to bigamy, inheritance, disputes, illegitimacy of children, fraudulent or coerced unions. To combat this, of 1215 tried to abolish clandestine marriages entirely by enforcing bans. And yet the clandestine marriage persisted, especially among lovers defying parental arrangements. But they had something more insidious: social exclusion. A couple found guilty of marrying outside, even after consummation in France during the late 14th century. Records show entire families excommunicated because one daughter had eloped with a servant. Her union was annulled. She was sent to a convent. The servant was banished, and the child they had declared illegitimate, barred from inheritance. We think of love as a private emotion, messy, sacred, uncontrollable. But for centuries, love was treated as a public act, one that required paperwork, witnesses, permission from the pulpit, and behind it all stood a quiet question: do you belong to each other, or do you belong to the Church first? They met in shadow, whispered in Latin and borrowed French, and spoke their vows by moonlight. There were no witnesses but the stars and, maybe, the stable boy who promised not to tell. It was enough. In the eyes of canon law, mutual consent, freely given, in present tense, was enough to constitute a valid marriage, even without witnesses, a priest, or a ceremony. And so, clandestine marriages were both a legal paradox and a cultural powder keg. They were technically valid, risking shame, exile, and eternal damnation just to bind themselves to each other, often with nothing but a whispered promise and a makeshift ring. Canon law, shaped by theologians like Gratian and refined in the decretals of Pope Gregory IX, made one thing clear: consent makes marriage. Consent, using words like "I take you as my wife, husband." The marriage was binding in God's eyes, regardless of whether a priest was present. The Church never liked this. It tried to discourage it, but it couldn't deny it. And so, a strange legal gray zone emerged: the secret marriage that was valid, but not acceptable. Let's walk through some actual historical records carefully, preserved in ecclesiastical court ledgers, where couples dared to marry without permission. In 1372, in the English town of Coventry, Agnes of St. Mildred's parish, age 15, they spoke their vows in her father's barn, in the presence of her cousin and a hired stable hand. When her father discovered the union, he petitioned the church court to annul it. His claim: she had not reached maturity, but Agnes insisted, in writing, that she had freely consented and that the marriage had been consummated. The court sided with her. Her husband was summoned back to Coventry and ordered to provide for her under threat of excommunication. Agnes won, but she was exiled from her parish. In Krakow, in 1448, a man named Isidore, low-born but wealthy, from his mill, secretly married Helena, a widow of noble stock. Her family had opposed the match and intended to remarry her to a local knight. Instead, she and Isidore exchanged vows before dawn in the mill house, witnessed only by the baker's apprentice. When discovered, her brother dragged her to the bishop's court. The judge declared the marriage valid, but ruled that Helena's inheritance rights were forfeit for disobeying her guardian. They remained married. They also lost everything. The motivations were many and very human. Class differences. Nobles fell in love with merchants, merchants with peasants. Family control. Guardians refused matches for political or financial reasons. Impatience, long engagement periods, and church paperwork took time. Shame. Pregnancies outside marriage pushed couples to marry in haste to preserve honor. Forbidden love. Interfaith or interregional couples defied the laws of the land. Secret marriage was a rebellion, sometimes foolish, sometimes brave, always risky. To crack down on clandestine unions, the church dispatched marriage inquisitors, clerics assigned to investigate rumors of unauthorized marriages. They worked with parish priests, local gossips, and disgruntled family members to root out couples who had skipped the bans or lied to clergy. When caught, couples were forced to appear before the bishop's court, confess under oath, present witnesses or tokens such as a ring, vow bracelet, or the exact words exchanged. Sometimes they were ordered to remarry publicly, a symbolic reblessing of a union already forged. But if the court found fraud, coercion, or lies, the marriage could be declared null and the couple separated by law. Some lovers worked within the law, finding ways to sneak past restrictions, travel to distant parishes where their identities were unknown, and marry under false names, claim that bans had been read in another church, often far away, use lay witnesses who could lie on their behalf, arrange a priest sympathetic to their cause, who performed marriages discreetly for a fee. In one German village, a priest was caught performing quiet weddings for coins and bread. He was publicly whipped and barred from hearing confessions for a year, but records show he resumed the practice within months. For those who failed to outwit the system, punishment varied: fines paid to the church or the injured family, often as dowry, restitution, penance, public acts of contrition, including walking barefoot to Mass, or wearing a sackcloth tunic with the words, "I sinned in love." Exile, forced relocation to distant villages or religious houses, shaming rituals in some towns, symbolizing the mess they had made of their virtue. Worst of all, if a child was born to a couple before public marriage, the child could be declared illegitimate, cut off from inheritance, and barred from becoming clergy. The punishment didn't just fall on the lovers, it echoed into the next generation. The central tension in medieval marriage was never about love, it was about visibility. The church could not tolerate unions it couldn't see, track, or control. A tool for order, secret marriage threatened that system, and so the church walked a tightrope. It acknowledged private consent as valid, but punished it severely if exercised without permission. For the lovers who dared to defy bans and bishops, the risk was real. Some succeeded, many suffered, but all of them, in their own way, declared something radical: that love, even in a world of contracts and courts, could still belong to the people who felt it. They didn't want permission, they wanted each other, and the world, religious, bureaucratic, rigid, wasn't sure what to do with that. For centuries, the church claimed dominion over marriage. It told you when to wed, who to wed, and whether the vows you whispered in secret counted before God. But even the strongest grip loosens over time. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, cracks began to show in the church's monopoly on marriage. What had once been a clear chain of command, banns, priest, altar, law, started to fracture under pressure from reformers, royal courts, and restless citizens. This final section explores how that ancient system crumbled, and how the modern concept of civil marriage emerged from centuries of religious rule. The Protestant Reformation, ignited in 1517 by Martin Luther, didn't just challenge the papacy, it redefined marriage itself. Luther declared that marriage was not a sacrament, but a worldly thing, a contract between two people, and not the business of the church. That idea rippled outward, reshaping marriage across Northern Europe. Protestant regions began removing ecclesiastical courts from marriage disputes, abolishing bans and priestly oversight permitting divorce. Under certain conditions, civil magistrates to oversee weddings now. Instead of kneeling before the altar, couples might stand before a town clerk. The witness wasn't a priest, but a mayor or councilman. This was revolutionary. It pulled marriage out of the heavens and anchored it to the earth, to cities, states, and secular law. As Protestantism spread, countries like Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands developed civil marriage codes. These laws included minimum ages, consent requirements, bans on forced marriage, clear rules for property and inheritance in England. After the English Reformation, the Anglican Church retained many Catholic traditions, but allowed for some flexibility. Priests still officiated, but Parliament now had influence, and by the 18th century, the idea of state-sanctioned marriage outside of church control had become thinkable. The French Revolution made it reality. In 1792, revolutionary France severed marriage from the church entirely. The revolutionaries, committed to secularism and equality, created the Civil Code, declaring that all marriages must be registered with the state. Only civil marriage would be legally recognized. Religious ceremonies could be performed, but had no legal standing. This model spread across Napoleonic Europe, reshaping marriage in Italy, Belgium, Poland, and beyond. The Church protested, but the revolution had changed the game. Marriage was no longer a ritual, it was a legal contract. With civil marriage came civil divorce. Previously, the Church allowed annulments, but not divorce. Once you were married, especially if the union was consummated, you were bound for life. But civil law introduced dissolution. A marriage could now end by mutual agreement, new tools to exit oppressive unions. Still, not all was fair. Divorce laws often favored men, and social stigma remained heavy. But the fact that leaving was even possible marked a profound shift. Even as states took control of marriage, the Church did not vanish. In Catholic countries, like Spain and Ireland, ecclesiastical influence lingered well into the 20th century. Couples often had to marry both civilly and religiously to be fully accepted. Church courts continued to exist in some form, especially around annulments, which the Catholic Church still handles separately from civil divorce. And in Orthodox regions, the priest retained significant ceremonial and spiritual authority, even as the state handled paperwork. But the Church was no longer the gatekeeper. It was now one voice among many, not the voice. Even in fully secular countries, the Church's legacy endures in subtle ways. Bans, though largely obsolete, they remain in law books in places like the UK. Marriage, language, phrases like speak, now or forever, hold your peace come straight from church custom. Ceremonial structures, the idea of rings, and pronouncement all originate from medieval religious practice. Moral expectations, cultural norms around fidelity, monogamy, and family structure are still shaped by centuries of Christian teaching. Even the concept of illegitimacy, now legally meaningless in most countries, lingers in our language. Social biases and family narratives. What began as a tool for moral and theological control has, in much of the world, become a celebration of personal choice. But that evolution was hard-won. From bans to licensing offices, from excommunication to divorce courts, from hidden vows to televised weddings, each change reflects a deeper transformation, a move from institutional authority to individual autonomy. And yet, the Church's long shadow still falls gently across the altar. For 1,000 years, marriage was a transaction overseen by heaven. It belonged to bishops, cardinals, scribes, and saints. Now, it belongs, at least on paper, to you. But the question remains, when you stand before your partner and say, "I do," whose rules are you really following? The state's, the Church's, or something older, quieter, and harder to name? Close your eyes and imagine a medieval wedding. You might even picture a bride in white, though that of course came centuries later. But you probably don't picture garlic or onions or crushed mugwort steeped in vinegar. And yet, for much of medieval Europe, especially in Central and Eastern regions, these pungent ingredients were essential to the bridal ritual. Before the veil was placed, before the blessings were spoken, and often even before the gown was tied, the bride was expected to undergo a ritual bath. But this was no leisurely soak. It was a spiritual scrubbing, a concoction of hot water, herbs, oils, salt, and the overwhelming scent of alliums, garlic, onion, leek, and shallot. Why? To purify the body, to protect the soul, and, most curiously of all, to make her undesirable to evil spirits and lustful men. In medieval belief systems, where medicine, magic, and theology blurred, smell played a powerful role. Odors were thought to affect mood, health, and spiritual purity. Garlic and onion weren't simply cooking ingredients. They were agents, substances that warded off evil, sickness, and temptation when applied to the bride. These ingredients served multiple functions. Spiritual armor. The smell repelled demons or wandering spirits who might target a vulnerable young woman. Physical cleanser. Their antibacterial properties were accidentally useful in removing dirt or skin infections. Chastity shield. A strong odor was thought to discourage arousal in both the bride and those around her. In short, this bath was not about beauty. It was about control, controlling the body, the environment, and the invisible forces said to surround marriage. Bathing was not a daily habit in the medieval world. Water was considered risky, too hot, and it could open the pores to evil. Too cold, and it could provoke illness. So, when a woman was bathed before her wedding, it was an exceptional event, one that had to be done carefully in noble homes. The bath might take place in a wooden tub near the hearth, filled with infusions of rosemary, garlic skins, wild thyme, sage, vinegar, and ash. Sometimes women added salted butter or animal fat, believing it would seal the body from spiritual intrusion. For peasants, the bath was more rustic, often taken outside near a stream, with herbs rubbed directly onto the skin. The final rinse was often done with water in which a whole onion or garlic bulb had been boiled, sometimes alongside nettle or crushed wormwood. The resulting smell, eye-watering, earthy, unmistakable, but to the medieval mind, it was the smell of protection. Medieval medicine, based on Galenic theory, taught that the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Garlic and onion were considered hot and dry, useful for correcting cold or damp conditions thought to cause lethargy, disease, or even infertility. Applying them to the skin was believed to wake the bride's flesh, draw out toxins, and balance her internal state before the shock of consummation. Midwives often supervised the bath, offering advice not only on herbs, but also on timing. A bride who bathed too early might lose the protection. Too late, and she might still carry the stain of her old household into the marriage bed. There was also a curious superstition. If the garlic failed to cling to the skin's scent, the bride was no longer a virgin. We often forget how important smell was in a pre-industrial world, before sanitation, before perfume, before daily soap. Scent wasn't an accessory. It was a social indicator, a moral signal, even a diagnostic tool. To smell of garlic and vinegar was to signal, I have been ritually prepared. It marked the bride as sealed, no longer an innocent child, not yet a sexual partner, a threshold figure, not desirable, not untouchable, but protected. And though the smell may have repelled the groom, that was partially the point. The first night was not meant to be romantic. It was meant to be correct, timed, safe, and watched over by God, or at least the midwife. These purification baths weren't limited to brides. In many cultures, similar rituals were performed for mothers after childbirth, to purge impurity for widows remarrying, to symbolically remove the touch of the previous husband for young girls during first menstruation, as a way to mark their transition. But the bridal bath was the most public. It was often witnessed by other women who would help scrub the skin, offer blessings, or tease the bride, sometimes cruelly, about what was to come. In some regions, the used bathwater was poured onto the doorstep of the groom's house, a form of spiritual warding to keep malevolent forces from entering on the wedding night. Medieval songbooks and herbal manuscripts are filled with references to these practices. In one 14th century Czech wedding song, the bride sings, "Garlic on my neck and vinegar on my skin. My love cannot kiss me till the priest lets him in." Another folktale from the Baltics tells of a bride whose garlic scent was so strong, her groom mistook her for a witch and refused to enter the bed. The marriage was annulled, not for any moral failing, but for a misapplication of ritual. Strength, we often think of clean as neutral, a removal of dirt, a preparation for beauty or comfort. But in the medieval world, cleansing was not cosmetic. It was spiritual, symbolic, and deeply social. The goal was not to smell nice. It was to smell prepared. To smell of garlic was to say, I am not open to interference. I am not here for pleasure. I am here for duty. It was the scent of virtue, however paradoxically unpleasant. Today, we perfume brides with florals. We scrub, exfoliate, and moisturize with lavender, jasmine, or rose. But for centuries, the bridal scent was not romantic. It was defensive. It was herbal armor. And so we might ask, what are the rituals we still perform to protect brides, not from evil, but from the world's gaze? And what do those rituals really smell like? Her name was Marta, and she was 15. The sky over her village in Lesser Poland was gray with early spring fog. Rain had come and gone, leaving the wooden shutters swollen and the thatch dripping with chill. But inside the cottage, a fire crackled low, and a tub was steaming in the corner of the room. It was Marta's wedding eve. Tomorrow she would marry Jacek, the second son of a local landholder. She had met him only once, briefly, during a procession, when she was 12. Since then, she had only seen his boots in the distance, and once accidentally caught his eye across the churchyard. Down now, he would be her husband. And before she could be his wife, she had to be cleansed, not just washed, not made beautiful. She had to be ritually scented, soaked in the same mixture her mother and her mother's mother had endured: garlic, onion, vinegar, and ash. It was mid-afternoon when the women arrived, neighbors, cousins, midwives, and the old healer who smelled faintly of beeswax and mead. They brought satchels of dried herbs, cracked jugs of sour vinegar, and bunches of pungent garlic tied with twine. Marta stood near the hearth, barefoot, in a loose linen shift. She didn't speak. Brides weren't supposed to. The midwife unwrapped a bundle of dried marjoram, sage thyme, and crushed nettles. She scattered them into the steaming water, muttering phrases in a language older than Polish, older than Latin, half Christian, half forgotten. Then came the onion, not sliced, not crushed, boiled whole in a separate pot, then poured brine and all into the tub. Finally, the garlic, raw and bruised, was thrown into the mix like coins into a wishing well. The smell hit the room like a wave, sharp, tangy, earthy. Ancient Marta was led to the tub. She stepped in slowly, hissing through her teeth as the hot water lapped at her ankles. She eased into it until the water kissed her shoulders, and her hair, still braided from the engagement ceremony, was gently undone. Danuta dipped a wooden ladle and poured water over Marta's head. Not too hot. We want the spirits to flee, not her soul. They washed her head to toe, scrubbing under her arms, behind her ears, between her toes. Every part of her body was treated like a vessel being prepared for sacred use. Salt was rubbed along her arms. Vinegar poured along her spine. Onion skins were scattered into the water as they washed her legs. All the while, the women spoke softly. She will be fruitful. She will be obedient. She will carry no curse into her new home. She will bleed only for children, not for sin. Marta closed her eyes and tried not to breathe too deeply as they bathed her. The women talked not to her, but about her. She hasn't bled yet, has she? No, but her hips have widened. That's good. She's quiet. Joch, mother will like that. She doesn't flinch at the garlic. That's better than her cousin Helena, who screamed like a stuck pig. Marta listened in silence, her face half submerged, her fingers clenching the tub's rim beneath the water. She knew this wasn't about cleanliness. It was about approval. Her body was being assessed, not for its beauty, but for its readiness. Her demeanor was being watched, not for joy, but for obedience. And the bath was her test. After the bath, Marta was lifted out and wrapped in a wool blanket. She was not dried with cloth, but left to air dry, another superstition meant to let the scents settle. Then Danuta approached with a clay pot of garlic hand-lard ointment, which she rubbed into Marta's armpits and along the soles of her feet. This will keep away cold and spirits alike, she said, as she dabbed a mixture of vinegar and rue. Oil behind Marta's ears, she added. Don't let your husband smell only flowers. He should smell the labor of your people. Garlic is for women who live through childbirth. It wasn't a joke. It was a warning. Only after the scenting did Marta receive her gown coarse. Flax linen, embroidered with red thread and wheat motifs. No jewelry, no perfume, no mirror. Instead, she was crowned with a wreath of garlic blossoms, wormwood, and rosemary. A single white ribbon trailed down her back, a token of virginity. Somewhere, distant bells rang. Not wedding bells, sheep bells, on a nearby hill, but Marta imagined the sound as a signal. Tonight, she would sleep alone. Tomorrow, she would not. For Marta, this ritual meant two things. It prepared her for the groom, not by making her attractive, but by shielding her from impurity and attention alike. The scent was both barrier and brand. It marked her exit from girlhood. The bath scrubbed away, not just dirt, but freedom. After tonight, she would answer to a new household, a new name, and new expectations. There was no rebellion in her, but there was resistance, silent, inner, like a knot that refused to loosen. She did not cry. That would be remembered. Brides who cried were said to bring stormy children. That night, Marta lay on a straw-filled mattress, her hair still damp, with garlic brine. Her mother came in briefly to kiss her forehead. Don't speak tomorrow unless spoken to, she said. That is how a wife is known, by the quiet of her tongue. Then the door closed, and Marta was alone. The smell filled her nostrils. Her body felt foreign, but in her chest something stirred. Not fear, not sadness, something curious, not hope, but the shape of it. Garlic once meant protection. Onion meant virtue. Vinegar, when splashed on the skin, meant spiritual cleanliness. But by the dawn of the modern era, these meanings began to wither, not by force, but by fashion, theology, and science. The bridal bath, once central to preparing a woman's body for marriage, lost its sharp scent. The garlic wilted, the vinegar soured. The bride's body, once warded, sealed, and cloaked in pungent ritual, was gradually handed over to perfume, lace, and silence. This final section traces how bridal purification rituals were reshaped over the centuries, first by religious reform, then by medical science, and finally by an emerging ideal of womanhood that prized fragrance over function and sweetness over strength. The first major blow to garlic-laced bridal rites came from within the church by the 16th century. Reform movements, both Protestant and Catholic, began condemning traditional herbal and folk practices as superstitions of the ignorant. Garlic, onion, and vinegar were deeply associated with pre-Christian traditions. Their use in ritual bathing, especially among women, was seen by many clerics as a vestige of paganism, a challenge to priestly authority, misguided, belief in magic over grace. In 1545, the Council of Trent formalized many Catholic reforms. While it did not specifically ban folk rituals, it strongly discouraged non-sacramental rites, especially those surrounding marriage, childbirth, and burial. In Protestant regions, especially Calvinist and Lutheran areas, clergy went further, preaching against bride baths, floral wreaths, and the devilish onion stewing of country women. Some villages were fined for continuing the practice, others complied, and so the scent of the bride began to change. As the Enlightenment dawned and scientific thinking spread, physicians began to reclaim authority over the human body, especially the female body. Bathing, once feared, was now encouraged, but with different reasoning. Hot water opened pores, not for spirits, but for hygiene. Garlic was effective against infection, but not required for spiritual protection. Vinegar could sanitize, but it was no longer thought to seal a woman's purity. Midwives were gradually replaced or supervised by formally trained physicians, mostly male, who dismissed centuries of female-led knowledge as ignorant. Texts from 18th century medical manuals advise bridal bathing may include lemon peel, lavender, and rose oil. No need for those rustic poultices of garlic and filth. And so the bath remained, but its ingredients were gentrified by the 19th century, especially in Western Europe. A new image of the bride had taken root, the angel in white. She was to be pale, soft-spoken, lightly perfumed, draped in delicate fabrics, emotionally modest, and physically passive. Garlic, in this world, had no place. Neither did onion, vinegar, or herbal ash. Instead, bridal preparation came to include scented soaps and powders, French perfumes, delicate oils made from roses, violets, or lilies. Transformation wasn't just about smell. It was about shaping the meaning of womanhood. The old scent, earthy, protective, sharp, had marked the bride as a vessel of survival and strength. The new scent marked her as an object of desire and display. But not everyone followed the trend. In rural Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Romania, and the Balkans, folk traditions persisted well into the 20th century. Ethnographic records from the 1930s and 40s describe bridal baths in carved wooden tubs filled with salt, garlic, stinging nettle, and soot. In some regions, old women still rubbed onion peels on the bride's hands to keep her from bruising in childbirth. And during World War II, some Eastern European brides revived garlic baths before hasty wartime weddings, invoking ancestral protection in the absence of priests, doctors, or safety. Even today, small fragments remain. In Serbia, some weddings still include a sprig of garlic hidden in the Bukane, rural Ukraine. Brides wear rosemary crowns laced with pungent herbs to ward off envy in parts of Romania. Brides are anointed with salt water and onion oil before entering the groom's home. These are not museum pieces. They are whispers of survival. You won't find onion baths on wedding registries, but the idea behind them, that the bride must be prepared, protected, and set apart, lives on in spa days-in bachelorette rituals, in the insistence that brides be glowing, fresh, fragrant, and flawless. The pressure hasn't. What does it mean that our ancestors covered brides in garlic and vinegar, while we anoint them in vanilla and rose? What were they trying to protect? And what have we, in chasing sweetness, forgotten to guard against? She runs, or tries to. Her shoes are wrong for this terrain, smooth leather soles, meant for dancing, not sprinting across wet grass. Her breath is tight, laughter choked behind her teeth. She hears footsteps, men's voices, a cousin calling out her name like a joke, another voice, unfamiliar, lower, closer than hands, grasping, lifting, and cheers erupt from the village. This is not an abduction, at least, not officially. It's a custom, a tradition, a sanctioned ritual in parts of medieval Central Europe, known as bride capture, a performance in which the bride-to-be is stolen, sometimes playfully, sometimes forcefully, and brought to the groom's household or wedding site. It's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be symbolic, but not every bride laughed. Not every groom stopped when the ritual was over. And not every village remembered the difference between tradition and truth. The bride capture custom is ancient, possibly predating Christianity, and can be traced across Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Carpathian, Poland, Western Ukraine, parts of the Balkans. In its earliest forms, the ritual may have echoed real abductions, a holdover from tribal or nomadic practices where women were forcibly taken to strengthen clans or replace female members lost to famine, disease, or war. But by the High Middle Ages, the ritual had largely evolved into ceremony, a mock abduction, often choreographed by both families, designed to test the groom's resolve, entertain the guests, symbolize the bride's transition from her family to her husband's hen theory. The bride was in on the joke. In practice, it was more complicated. The abduction usually took place on the day of the wedding or the night before. The bride would be stolen by a group of young men, usually cousins, neighbors, or the groom's friends, and hidden somewhere nearby. A Barna relative's house, a forest clearing, a cart covered with Hothagroom, sometimes accompanied by his groomsmen or brothers, would then search for her, often bribing locals for clues or performing challenges to win her back. This could involve physical contests, drinking trials, riddles, or songs negotiations with the bride's captors only. After ransom was paid, often in the form of food, drink, or coin, would the bride be returned. It was festive. it was loud. But for the bride, it was often exhausting and humiliating. Anthropologists interpret the ritual in multiple ways. Symbolic removal, representing the bride's separation from her natal family. Fertility, rite echoing ancient ideas about dominance, possession, and procreation. Social theater, a way to let the community participate in the transformation of the bride. Comic relief, a structured form of chaos before the serious ceremony, but woven into each interpretation is a darker thread. The idea that a woman's consent is ceremonial, not central, because even when the bride knew what was coming, she wasn't asked to approve it. Her discomfort, her silence, her resistance, all were expected, part of the show, and sometimes that line blurred too far. Not all bride captures were harmless. In several documented cases across the 13th and 14th centuries, the ritual turned violent or real. In 1294, a Hungarian noblewoman named Ilona Szigeti was abducted in jest by her betrothed's kin. She was hidden in a cellar and assaulted by one of the groomsmen. The groom refused to marry her afterward. She was sent to a convent in 1411 in a village outside Brasov, modern Romania. A bride was accidentally injured during her recapture when her groom knocked over a stone fence. She died 2 days later from infection. The family paid Werga. The wedding continued with her cousin in 1470. A peasant bride in Ruthenia was captured by a neighboring village's young men during a festival. What began as mock ritual turned into a real kidnapping. She was never found. A local legend claims she became a river ghost who cursed weddings near the stream. These stories, though exceptional, cast a shadow over the custom because when a society turns abduction into tradition, who protects the boundary? In most versions of the ritual, the bride is expected to protest, cry out, flee, though not too far resist, though not too hard surrender. In the end, to her role, her protests are performed and often mocked. Songs were sung to reinforce the tone. Don't cry, little dove. The barn is warm tonight. He'll carry you like a sack of flour and make you his with fright. Or another, from Slovakia. The bride runs fast, but love runs faster. Tie her hands with ribbon so she remembers laughter. These refrains taught generations that resistance was romantic, that chasing, grabbing, and claiming were signs of love. They also taught that a bride's body was a prize, not a person. The church, as with many folk customs, responded slowly and unevenly in some dioceses, especially in Transylvania and the Hungarian plains. Bishops issued decrees banning pagan-style chases or prenuptial dramas involving force. But enforcement was rare. Parish priests often participated, joking along with the villagers, blessing the couple afterward as if nothing had occurred. In one 15th century priest's manual from Bohemia, a margin note reads, "If the bride is injured during capture, delay the ceremony. Bruises spoil the photographs." Of course, there were no photographs. It was sarcasm, and a sign that even clergy knew the risks. Bride capture is a ritual performed under the illusion of control. But behind the laughter, we find truths that are harder to laugh off, that the bride is not the center, but the object, that her resistance is scripted, that tradition can excuse almost anything if framed as celebration, and, for many women, this was not a performance. It was the real beginning of their marriage, a moment where their comfort, boundaries, and voice were made secondary in front of the entire village. Today, You'll still find echoes of this ritual in bouquet tosses, teasing games, or staged stealing the bride performances at Slavic weddings. It's called fun. But perhaps we should ask, when does a tradition stop being tradition and start being a rehearsal for silence? The morning mist rose like a second veil over the Ruthenian hills. The river, still and gray, curved quietly through the edge of the village. Chickens stirred in the straw. Dogs barked in the distance, and Katerina, 16, stood outside her family's home, wrapped in a cloak too large for her frame. Today was her wedding day, and she would be stolen before noon. Katerina had known for weeks that her marriage to Stepan, the miller's son, would follow tradition. He was older, well-liked, sturdy of hand, and soft of word, but the custom was not his to change. His uncles had already prepared the wagon that would carry her to the clearing. Her father had agreed to the chase. Her cousins had practiced the grab. Everyone would smile. Everyone would laugh. And yet, her stomach was a knot of cold rope. She had heard the stories. One bride broke her ankle in the forest and was carried back weeping. Another came back with bruises, explained away as part of the game won years ago, had disappeared into the woods and refused to marry at all. Katerina would not run far, but she would not run willingly either. By late morning, the village bell rang, not a church bell, but a handheld one, rung by her uncle, signaling that the bride was missing. Katerina's face was veiled. Her aunts pretended to hide her behind the stable. But the hiding spot was known, rehearsed, even scheduled. This was performance, but the fear was real. She was found quickly. Stepan's cousins burst into the courtyard, laughing, chanting songs about stealing bread and stealing brides. One pulled the veil from her head. Another grabbed her around the waist and hoisted her over his shoulder. Katerina didn't scream. She went rigid. The village cheered. Just part of the ritual, someone said. She was placed in a hay-lined cart and drawn away from the village, down toward the river bend, where Stepan waited by a circle of oaks. The men drank from flasks. The older women sang folk songs, laced with innuendo. Katerina sat silently, her dress catching on the cart's wooden edge. A girl beside her, a younger cousin, whispered, "They say the faster they catch you, the better the marriage." Katerina didn't answer. She was counting her breaths, one for her mother, one for her sister, dead last winter, one for the version of herself that would never come back from this river path. At the forest edge, Stepan approached. He was alone, holding a woven belt, his ransom. It was traditional, a gift offered to win the bride back from her captors. But the ransom was symbolic. The real cost had already been paid in the public stripping of Katerina's agency. She was handed over with ceremony. She did not speak, helped her down gently, a quiet apology in his hands. But nothing could erase what had just happened, what everyone had just seen, what everyone would pretend to forget. Later, after the feast, after the priest's Latin and the toasts and the dances, Katerina would make a different kind of vow, not to her husband, not to God, but to herself. That vow was simple: I will never let anyone carry my daughter. And she meant it. For Katerina, the ritual had been a sanctioned violation, not in body, but in will. Her face was not bruised. Her voice had not cried out, but something quiet had cracked. She understood that the game was older than her, that she had performed well, that Stepan had played his role, and played it kindly. But the ritual had told her something clearly, that her resistance was expected, that her capture was romantic, that her silence was graceful. It had taught her how the world worked, and now she would begin the long, slow work of unlearning it, not by breaking tradition, but by refusing to pass it on. A century later, a folklorist collecting songs in rural Ruthenia recorded a lullaby sung by an old woman in a kitchen. The lyrics went, "Don't run, my girl, the path is wet. The man will find you soon, I bet. But if he loves you, he'll walk, not race. And he'll offer arms, not a chase." The woman who sang it, her name was Katerina, too. Not the same one, but perhaps not entirely different. Traditions do not die. They are softened, reshaped, whispered in kitchens, and woven into lullabies. Sometimes they are reversed by women who refuse to run. Katerina never told her daughter to resist tradition. She simply never let her be carried, and in doing so, she changed the story. Because sometimes the quietest revolutions begin not in shouting, but in stillness. And so we ask, how many rituals are we still performing because we're afraid to be the first to stand still?